Here we are, Lunch with Friends and Strangers, a wonderful program that we've put on with the General Alumni Association, our dear friends over there, Kat Nichols, and everyone has been such a fantastic partners in putting this program on. And we do hope some more folks will be tuning in and joining us for the event today. The idea, of course, in Lunch with Friends and Strangers is we bring in a friend, a faculty member who we all know and love, and sometimes a new person that we are their friends by nature of being faculty. And we bring in a stranger, often someone who is perhaps you've heard of, but you might not know well enough. Sometimes you've never heard of. And I think the vast majority of us know who our stranger is today. But first, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the Cotton Merker Group at Morgan Stanley, who have been wonderful supporters of our programs for years. We're very grateful for their support, especially of our K through 12 programs. Carolina Meadows, a fantastic partner with us, especially supporting our live programs at Flyleaf Books and our Ventures and Ideas weekend seminars, and recently come on supporting our K-12 programs as well. And of course, we want to thank the General Alumni Association, like I mentioned, who are our partners on this program and several more. We're always grateful for their support. But without further ado, and of course, one first person to thank behind the scenes, I need to thank Paul Bonici, who always makes, he's making all of this run for us and has been doing such a fantastic job. So thank you for that, Paul. I know that you're behind the Carolina Public Humanities little icon there. Without further ado, I'm going to invite our distinguished guest. He is none other than Donald Raleigh, the J. Richard Judson Distinguished Professor of History, an expert on 20th century Russian history in particular. And we have to add the emeritus to that now, don't we?
As of January 1.
As of January 1. Well, a long distinguished career here at Carolina, but certainly Professor Raleigh's work has continued and will continue because a very special project that we're working on that is, of course, related to our stranger. Don, do you know who our stranger is today?
Leonid Brezhnev.
Leonid Brezhnev, indeed. Let me pull up. I'm going to just make sure everyone is aware and situated here. I'm sure you all know who this person is, but I'm going to pull up this image because I think it's for many of us it might be, and for me in particular, this is Brezhnev as many of us imagine him. What year would you say this picture comes out, Don?
My guess would be about 1978.
1978, and that's right around the time I was saying earlier on. I was born in 1969 and was fairly politically aware, and so I knew what the Soviet Union was. I was aware of the Cold War, and whenever I would picture Soviet leaders, it was this image, and it was the idea of a sort of, he just not someone I could relate to, right?
Well, not someone you could relate to, but someone that people in the Soviet Union, some of the people in the Soviet Union may have been sharing your feelings at that point, and I'll talk about that.
Well, and what's surprising is that just a few years earlier in 1971, this is also Brezhnev and a very different take. I get a sense of cosmopolitanism from this picture. I get a sense of someone who cares about their appearance and who also seems remarkably healthier.
Yeah, this is a portrait or a photograph by Brezhnev's official photographer, who, by the way, died this past week.
Oh, wow.
And he has a remarkable collection. Not all of the photos have been published. And I had been in correspondence with him, but it had been very hard to get him to release some photos for me. He really wanted me to confirm that my book would be very positive. And because he greatly respected and admired Brezhnev. And by the way, Brezhnev was a clothes horse of sorts. He loved good style. He had a personal tailor, and he was the best dressed person in the Kremlin. And everyone knew that and talked about it. And it's something that Richard Nixon commented on after meeting him.
Oh, wow. Wow. So, I mean, I guess we should let the cat out of the bag that although you're retired, your major project is, in fact, a magisterial work, well, we hope it will be, on a biography. And this is your first official biography, writing a biography. And why Brezhnev, and why did you want to take this on?
Well, I have to, I'm working on a biography of Brezhnev, and for many reasons. One, despite the fact that he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union between 1964 and 1982, and therefore was in power longer than anyone else except for Stalin in the 20th century. Apart from, despite that, because of the last years of his life and the Gorbachev era, when Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev came to power, one thing that Soviet leaders did, there was no mechanized or institutionalized system, I should say, for replacing leaders. Now, they did, within the Kremlin, they discussed the possibilities, they voted, but there was no institutionalized vehicle for that. And what happened, the person who usually came to power immediately had to separate himself from the person who had been in power, usually very critically, right? Yeah. So Gorbachev was implementing a reform program known as Perestroika. And what he had to do is he had to justify this. He had to account for it, and he had to distance himself from the previous leadership, Brezhnev. So it was Gorbachev who capitalized on this trope that appeared in the late Soviet era under Brezhnev of stagnation. Yes. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev was a period of a lost opportunity. Now, arguably, it's probably true from the period of 1975 to 1982, when Brezhnev was really infirm, sick, wanted to retire, and his comrades wouldn't let him. But from 1964 to 1974, before he had a massive stroke and actually was declared clinically dead and resuscitated, Brezhnev was a master politician. He was a brilliant politician, and one whose role in assuring world peace has been underestimated.
So that image I showed of Brezhnev later in life, sort of looking infirm, waving on, that's not just an outsider's perspective, as you're saying. This is also a part of the Soviet way of kind of looking at the leadership, Gorbachev being considerably younger and saying, and reevaluating the Soviet Union and personalizing it with Brezhnev. I mean, it's not necessarily fair, is it?
Absolutely. Here, and Max, you're, as a French historian, you're aware of the desacralization of the royal family in the years leading up to the French Revolution. And I would argue that something almost comparable happened in Brezhnev's late years as well. And that in part had to do with mass media and a ruling, a decree that Soviet television had to show Brezhnev, give him more airtime, 3 times more airtime than any other political figure. Now, this is great when he looked like the photograph when he was, looked like a movie star, right? But by 1977, 78, this was no longer right. This was no longer.
We want more of this. We want more of this, and
more of this, and less of the
less of the
picture of the infirm leader who actually had a great deal of difficulty. He slurred his speech. He was heavily medicated.
Wow.
And had ill-fitting dentures, which bothered him. And there were people saw this on television when he was having great difficulty reading a speech. And there was one episode at the very end of his career in which he started reading a wrong speech.
Oh, Lordy. And so they don't, instead of having the 25th Amendment option, they just continue to, we'll talk about that later on, why they continued as opposed to replacing him, that there was some reason why you want to keep Brezhnev in there.
And despite the fact of the importance he played because of Gorbachev and because of the stagnation trope and distancing the reform program of Perestroika and Glasnost from what came before, there's been no substantial historical writing on Brezhnev. There was no biography until the turn of the century. We had a sort of a popular biography. And since then, only one really academic biography. And we have fortunately, major new sources came to light within the past decade or so that make a biography now possible.
Well, we're looking forward. I feel like we're going to cut him short if we don't let Brezhnev be a younger person at some point. So what can we, what do we, when was Brezhnev born? What was the milieu he was born into? What sort of family was he born into? This is, of course, pre-Russian Revolution. So what can you tell us?
Well, Brezhnev was born on December 19th, 1906, in the town of Kamenskaya. And by the way, the shirt I'm wearing,
Yeah,
I bought
we'll
right
make sure
near,
people can see that there.
right near Kamenskaya in 1906, in 2006, from 100 years after he was born, from a village, a peasant woman who was peddling these. A little did I know at the time that I'd be writing about Brezhnev. He was born in 1906. His family came from central Russia, from Kursk province. His father was a metallurgical worker in what was then in Imperial Russia, one of the largest metallurgical factories. It was one of the really the very largest.
So he's a laborer.
Itself was a small town, about 25,000 at the time. Today it has a population of approximately Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay.
So it was a working class family.
Yeah. How common was it for a working class family to have a photograph sessions, obviously in a studio somewhere?
Yeah, I think it was fairly common, particularly for what would be considered skilled workers, right? Metallurgical workers were paid fairly well given the standards of the time. And one of the interesting things about the family, Brezhnev, his sister, and his brother all worked in this metallurgical factory at some point in their life. So it was really was the hub and the heart of the town.
So he's young.
Is the one with the cap on, the oldest of the three children, and that's his sister Vera and his baby brother Yakov.
Very cute kids.
Now, Brezhnev was known as be a very handsome man, as you could see, and his brother as well. I should point out here that next to the picture of the family,
I'll pull that up,
is the picture of Brezhnev's party when he joined the Communist Party in 1929. What's interesting here, whereas item number 4 is nationality. He crossed Russian out and put Great Russian, and then here he crossed out his native language. He at first wrote Ukrainian, and he crossed that out and he wrote Russian. Now, what's really interesting is even now, it's impossible to say what Brezhnev's nationality was. The family came from Central Russia, but there was a Ukrainian minority there. They moved to Ukraine. Brezhnev grew up bilingually, certainly. On his party materials, he wrote Ukrainian as nationality, but then on some he put, during the war, at the end of the war, World War II, he put Russian. But then on his 1947 passport, he put Ukrainian again. It wasn't until the 50s that he began to consistently use Russian.
What pressure would he have been under? Here is that later passport to in 1929 to declare. What internal pressure, external pressure? Was there an advantage to putting Russian?
Well, I think there were several things going on. That's a great question. In the 1930s or the 1929, he grew up in Ukraine. He was stationed there. And the Soviet government had introduced a policy called nativization or indigenization. It was an affirmative action program to bring various national groups into the Communist Party. So if you're working in Ukraine, there was some benefit in being Ukrainian at that point, right? And then again, during the war, though, when some of his paperwork said he was Russian, it was probably beneficial to be a Russian, particularly because he was at the front. And then in 1947, this town, Zaporozhye, he was in, is in Ukraine. It had the largest steel plant in the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was sent there to get it up and running as it had been destroyed. So given that environment, again, it probably made sense to be a Ukrainian at that point. Did it matter to him? I don't think so, actually.
Wow. I mean, and is that because he is ideologically communist and nationality wasn't as important? I mean, as when you say it didn't matter to him, was that based on his ideological beliefs
Well, the,
about?
you know, the ideology certainly is internationalist, but he also grew up in a bilingual environment. So, for instance, when I'm reading archival material from the late 1930s in Ukraine, I'm reading a party congress. People are speaking, 3 or 4 speak Russian, then someone gets up and speaks in Ukrainian. And there's no translation in the documents. People understood each other. So it's fairly common. But after the early 50s, he remained consistently Russian.
So let's get a little bit to his personal life. When did he marry, and who did he marry, and what are the what does marriage mean for somebody who's rising in the party?
Brezhnev married Victoria Petrovna in the mid 1920s. They met at a dance. He was a handsome man, and there's been lots of rumors about him being a womanizer. But I think all the data information suggests that those are exaggerated. Although he certainly did have a few significant romances. Brezhnev married Victoria Petrovna, and from the very time he was in Ukraine in the post-war, rumors spread, and these rumors particularly had a lot of, they were particularly widespread in the early 1970s when he was in power. Mm-hmm. There was a informal group called the Russian Right or Nationalist Party, sort of an underground party that promoted rumors that Victoria Petrovna was Jewish. This party was anti-Semitic and ultra-nationalist. Victoria Petrovna herself, she grew up in an area that had a lot of Poles. Victoria is a very traditional Polish name. It's not a traditional Russian name at all. And she claimed that she's Russian and that there were so many Victorias that the family named her Victoria. Solzhenitsyn claims she's Ukrainian, and some dissident historians in the 1970s insist she's Jewish. These rumors haunted her all her life. She was with Brezhnev in France in the mid-70s, and French Jews were holding placards saying, help let your people go to Israel. And wow. She said, you know, gee, if I said I wasn't Jewish, they'd say I'm rejecting my nationality.
Yeah. Wow. So, interesting. So was she a member of the Communist Party as well?
She was not. And they had 2 children, Yuri and Galina. Yuri, the son, was older. And Brezhnev's family life brought a great deal of pain to him. Mm-hmm. Both children were alcoholics. His son Yuri, a quiet one, later after Brezhnev died, arrested for embezzlement and corruption, and then released, but much of his property had been confiscated. Mm-hmm. Galina was a free spirit. She had Brezhnev's spirit. She was raised by a very accommodating mother who let her have her way. Mm-hmm. I guess you'd say she was a sort of a spoiled kid who had all these benefits.
Look at that puckish smile that we have over here on the right. That just, to me, that looks like a troublemaker.
Oh, she would not join the Komsomol, the communist youth group. Brezhnev was head of the Republic of Moldavia after World War II. She was going to college there. She quit. She ran off with a circus performer, married him. He was twice her age. They had a child. When that marriage unraveled, she married someone a really young circus performer who had been like a teenager when she first
Another circus performer.
Another circus performer. Brezhnev had that marriage annulled. He had he had an intervention.
Wow.
They had the marriage annulled. A recent documentary, a Russian documentary on Galina that I watched about a month ago, a very knowledgeable person put the documentary together, argued that this romance she had with this young person was really true love, and it broke her heart and contributed and fueled her alcoholism. But then she later married a very handsome man within the Ministry of the Interior, but they didn't get along. They fought.
Well, he wasn't a circus performer. She
It was a
has a
certain.
type. she has a
So
preferred type.
the sad thing is, her own daughter, whom Brezhnev and his wife raised, not Galina, not that she put her mother's alcoholism. It's a progressive illness. She was hospitalized in the mental hospital and died in one, alone, pretty much alone.
That's very sad. I understand that Yuri's son, Andrei, is involved in the Communist Party in the Soviet Union even to this day.
Yeah, Andrei, who died prematurely a few years ago.
Oh, he did. I did not realize that.
Yeah, it was fairly recently. He believed his grandfather had gotten the bum rap during Perestroika, and he created a new Communist Party. He argued that the Communist Party that survived the solution of the Soviet Union, that this had deviated from true Marxism. He created this new party. It never, I think the largest enrollment figures were under 10,000.
Wow.
And he died in the Crimea as sort of a real estate speculator. But he had Brezhnev's eyebrows.
Well, that's the first thing you need in order to get that position of leadership, apparently. I'm working on it, Don, by the way. I want to get into his career some, but I do want to mention, that he did have service in World War II, and it was a political commissar. How was this an important moment in his life and in his professional development? His work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say here, Brezhnev lived through World War I in Kamenskaya. It was overrun by Germans, Ukrainians, the Red Army. He had it was a miserable childhood once the war broke out, right? It interrupted his schooling. And then during World War II, he was the only one in the Politburo when he was general secretary who had actually been in the trenches. He spent the entire front at the war. And this experience and the horrific devastation of World War II, in which this country lost 27 million people, including 17 million civilians. People's homes and cities and farms were the battlefields of the war. This left such an impression on him that he was determined that peace was essential. He never wanted his people of the Soviet Union to go through anything like it again.
I remember we had talked about Soviet man of peace.
Man of peace.
And so his wartime experience was incredibly formative for that. And
very formative.
So I want to get to leadership, but before we get to when he becomes a leader, can we speak a little bit about his sort of years during Stalin and then during Khrushchev? And I understand he became sort of was Khrushchev's man at one point. Or maybe I'm oversimplifying that. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like in the 50s for Brezhnev and what he was doing?
Yeah, I want to take it back a little bit and just say that I had mentioned that he born in 1906. There had been revolution in 1905 in Russia. World War I broke out in 1914. Revolution in 1917. Civil War 1918 through 21, 22. At the end of the 20s, Stalin launches the so-called Stalin Revolution. Forced industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, gulag, labor camps, then World War II, right?
Yeah.
So these were crisis times. A crisis represents both danger and opportunity. And how Brezhnev benefited from this was that he joined the party in 1929, and under Stalin, beginning with 1929, Stalin launched what was called the Cultural Revolution. This was an affirmative action program. Stalin argued that the Soviet intelligentsia, who ran things, was really inherited from the czars, right? It was an imperial intelligentsia. It wasn't trustworthy. It could sabotage Soviet power. We needed our own intelligentsia. So what he did, he implemented an affirmative action program, and he sent several 100,000 Brezhnevs, people from working class peasant backgrounds, to college. They were trained as engineers in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
And as other people were arrested and sent in gulag, it created enormous amount of upward social mobility for these newly minted engineers who joined the party, completed their education, and very soon moved up within the factory, often as factory directors and such.
Stepping into places of people that have been removed.
Right, and creating, if you look at the Politburo in the 1970s when he was in power, everyone in the Politburo had this biography. If you look at a group biography, they all were born within the 5-year period. They all were trained as engineers. They all benefited from Soviet power, right?
Mm-hmm.
This legitimated Soviet power, this affirmative action program.
It's in a way.
In World War II, he did meet Khrushchev in Ukraine. Khrushchev was party boss in Ukraine in the 30s. They first met there. Khrushchev was back in the 40s after World War II when Brezhnev, after the war, was appointed head of the party in this town Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River, not far from where he grew up. He got the largest steel mill in the country up and running again. Because he did such a good job, he was sent to Moldova, then Moldavia, which had been reincorporated into the Soviet Union as a result of World War II. And this was a very important assignment because what he had to do was, quote unquote, Sovietize Moldavia. That meant implementing collectivization of farms, taking over the factories, et cetera, et cetera. He then went to Moscow when Khrushchev came to power after Stalin. Khrushchev sent Brezhnev in 1955 to Kazakhstan.
Okay.
Khrushchev launched a pet project called the Virgin Lands Campaign. The idea was Soviet agriculture was a labor-intensive one. Yields, productivity didn't increase over the years. They just expanded the amount of land under cultivation. Khrushchev's idea was to plow up millions of so-called virgin acres of virgin land that had not been used before, grow wheat and rye there, and let the grain growing regions in Europe grow corn, a fodder crop, which was not widely grown in the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Soviet Union had enormous yields, great livestock herds, more meat, more dairy, et cetera, et cetera.
This is if you're doing guns and butter, this is the butter part of it.
Yeah, that's the butter part of it. So he went to Kazakhstan as second secretary, and the next year was appointed first secretary, and did a great job of implementing this harebrained scheme of Khrushchev's in Kazakhstan. Khrushchev brought him back to Moscow. He was in the Central Committee. After 1957, when there was an attempt to overthrow, he was in the Politburo at that point. And he also masterminded, he was a protege of Khrushchev's, but he masterminded Khrushchev's ouster in 1964.
So here we have a picture of Brezhnev at this point is the head of the Presidium. Is that correct? Of the Soviet Union, technically the head of state. How does that work?
Yeah, apart from the, Khrushchev was head of the party, the general secretary. Back then under Khrushchev, they renamed that first secretary. Mm-hmm. But historically, to be consistent, it was general secretary. Brezhnev was chair of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. That was the Soviet government, the government apparatus. So he was in effect the second, and a member of the ruling Politburo within the party. So he in effect was the second person in the government.
And here we have, in that capacity, giving the the Order of the Soviet Union. What is the award he's giving? The highest award.
Yeah, probably there were several. I'm not sure which one, but this was on Khrushchev's birthday in April
of 1964.
Now tell us. In October, he was overthrown.
So what's going through Brezhnev's mind when he's doing this? Does he already know that Khrushchev is on the way out? And how does he assume power? Earlier on, and we were talking about that wonderful movie, The Death of Stalin. And it's a farcical look at collective leadership and trying to figure out what to do. But it does give you this sort of a pantomime of collective leadership. How was it different? How was this transfer of power the same and different as to what had occurred just 11 years previously, 12 years
Yeah,
previously?
thanks for that question, Max. Stalin definitely ruled as a dictator. At the end of his life, there was some distribution of certain powers to some of the other, a few select members of the Politburo. When Khrushchev won the succession, there was a succession crisis and the battle for power. Khrushchev, within a year, came out on top. He presented the new leadership as a collective leadership, that Stalin had violated collective leadership and that this was collective leadership. Keep in mind that Khrushchev inherited, in effect, Stalin's Politburo, the ruling elite of about 15 men. There was one woman ever, and it was actually under Khrushchev. And an attempt was made in 1957 to overthrow Khrushchev by this group. The attempt failed. We in the West were stunned. We thought maybe the Soviet Union is democratizing. Khrushchev flew in the Central Committee, a group of about 300 people, and they all voted to keep him in power. And at that point, he appointed his own Politburo. That's when Brezhnev and his people he picked, right? Mm-hmm. But sad to say, this notion of collective leadership, there was a cult of Khrushchev. He ruled as arbitrarily as Stalin in many ways, and there were no curbs on his power. Soviet public opinion had turned against Khrushchev by 1962 in a big way. Right?
Was that economic? Was it the Sino-Soviet split? What was the cause of the dissatisfaction?
One Soviet writer, a dissident writer, called it the 3 C's: corn, Cuba, and China. By corn, he means Khrushchev's harebrained schemes and in regard to the economy in particular. Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis was brought on the brink of nuclear war. And of course, the China split, which had now gone open. But I think if you look at what was undone in the first months after Khrushchev was ousted, I think that is the real reasons, right? They just undid all these policies, including Khrushchev was going to, actually Khrushchev split the Communist Party into 2 subgroups. And he introduced terms that every 5 years people would have to come up to be reselected or reelected, and there'd be more than one candidate. Party members didn't like this, and he was constantly replacing people and shuffling cadres all over the place. In other words, their life was unstable. They couldn't count on being in their position for any length of time because Khrushchev kept on reorganizing the administration. This is the straw that broke the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. So Brezhnev was one of a handful that masterminded this coup. Unlike 1957, they met with the Central Committee members, the 300 beforehand, and got them on board.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I read that, and Khrushchev, for his part, kind of accepted it.
Yes, he did. I think he had been tipped off, actually. I think he was expecting it probably earlier. Now, Brezhnev initially, again, ruled in this manner of collective leadership. They argued that Khrushchev had created his own cult, that he had violated collective leadership. And for the first 5 years or so, Brezhnev came out on top. He became first among equals by around 1971, when he held a big party congress, and it was clear in terms of foreign policy. And take Willy Brandt, for instance, the German leader who had met Brezhnev 2 years before, and then in 71, he said, wow, he's clearly in charge now.
Yeah, and this is when we signed the treaty.
Now, that said, Brezhnev was a brilliant consensus builder. He brought in all sorts of interest groups within the leadership. And I've now had access. 2 years ago, they opened up the Politburo minutes. I've been reading these Politburo minutes in Moscow. They discussed things. They voted on things.
Wow.
And Brezhnev made everyone feel that his voice mattered.
So, and at the same time that he is actually beginning to pull the levers more and more himself, he's giving the idea that this is being done in a collective manner.
And it really seemed to be, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, his health turns for the worse in the mid-70s. And then the Brezhnev cult actually grew to monstrous proportions when Brezhnev was already pretty much incapacitated and in poor health.
So I want to invite, of course, all of our guests to write questions in the question and answer phase. And I just happen to take a quick peek at a question that's already there. And it's R.E. Ray Hetem. I don't know how to exactly pronounce that. And it just happens to be the next thing I was going to ask anyway. Would love to hear Professor Raleigh's perspective on Brezhnev's relationship with Nixon and the effect this relationship had on the peace process. And I was just about to share this picture. So I guess speaking a little bit of the international reception of Brezhnev, how does he fit in the Cold War and with U.S. relations?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and this picture because I think it sort of captures Brezhnev's robust personality. I mean, he was quite a bon vivant in many ways. So I actually was so fascinated. I should say that Brezhnev, unlike any other Kremlin leader, took detailed work notes. And I was involved in their publication in Russia a few years ago. That and the opening of the archives and all sorts of published memoirs by other people allow this reassessment of Brezhnev as man of peace, right? And under Brezhnev, he fully promoted détente. He's really the architect of détente in many regards. And he also pushed, he had a lot of pushback within the Kremlin regarding summit meetings with American leaders. He argued with the head of the military and with other prominent individuals in the Soviet military-industrial complex to make these allow these summit meetings to take place. Nixon came to Moscow in 1972. Brezhnev came to the United States in 73, and there was another Nixon one again, literally weeks before he resigned. And then Brezhnev, at the end of that year, met Gerald Ford in Vladivostok. Right. These meetings are remarkable because at the very first meeting, when the Nixons arrived in Moscow, the schedule was that they'd be taken to their rooms within the Kremlin, and then after some rest, there'd be a meeting, and it would include, you see the person in the picture wiping his face, that's Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, and the person behind Brezhnev is his translator. What happened was the Nixons basically got to the Kremlin, and the translator went to Nixon and said, Brezhnev wants to see you right now. So Nixon didn't even have time to unpack. He went to see Brezhnev. It was a meeting lasting a few hours, Brezhnev, Nixon, and Brezhnev's translator. Brezhnev's diplomacy was inextricably personal as well as political. And the only record we have is that of Brezhnev's translator. But this, you can imagine how Kissinger reacted to this. He was furious. You can imagine how Gromyko reacted to this. He was furious, right? Yeah. So taking these risks was very Brezhnev. And I have to say that Nixon in his diaries has some wonderful, insightful comments about the Soviet leadership. Before Nixon met Brezhnev, he was briefed by Robert Conquest, a British poet who became a specialist on the Gulag and a real enemy of communism. Conquest told him that the Kremlin leaders were mediocrities. Nixon in his diaries writes, this is absurd. These are really, he said Brezhnev was the best politician in the room. This is Nixon saying.
Interesting.
Right? And he said, don't mess with these people. They're really smart, they're shrewd, they're clever, and they do their best to present their country's interests.
Very, we're going to have to allow more questions in here, but I want to make sure we get to a couple more key ideas. And one is that, you talk about a Soviet man of peace, but many people also associate Brezhnev with, of course, the Brezhnev Doctrine and the hardening of the Soviet perspective on independence especially in Eastern Europe. how do you square those two things, the Brezhnev Doctrine with desire for peace?
Yeah, I would say this. We didn't have nuclear war, right?
Yeah.
And we had détente, and the world was, he achieved nuclear parity with the United States. Both sides were advocating peace through strength, right? A mirror image of each other. So within the fact that the Imperial Russia was overrun in World War I, Soviet Russia in World War II, the Soviets wanted a buffer zone on their border. And when Hungary tried to remove itself from the Warsaw Pact in 1956, encouraged by the United States, we didn't do anything to support them. We weren't going to go to war over Hungary, and we certainly weren't going to go to war over Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Right? That said, Brezhnev agonized over this decision. We now have the complete records of the conversations that went into making this decision. So
here
the
he is
last
with
thing Brezhnev wanted to do, the insomnia tormented him during this period, and he was chain smoking, and he believed that Dubček lied to him, and that's when he gave the green light to invade. And by the way, some of the other Eastern European leaders were strongly promoting invasion as well, because they were fearful of the Soviet contagion, or this Czechoslovakian contagion. So, the Brezhnev Doctrine basically was, we have the right to intervene when socialism is at risk in our own backyard.
And I guess if you're saying already the China has been cast off, international communist solidarity is gone.
It's completely gone
by this point. So this is really a geopolitical move and a sort of the Soviet Union for it, like you were saying, for the buffer zone for that state itself.
Right. And the decision to invade Afghanistan, 10 years later, roughly, Brezhnev now, is very infirm. It was a rump Politburo that made the decision, and it was 4 people who knew better who convinced him. Brezhnev didn't want to, and they said this will be really a short-term measure to block American imperialism. Of course, it wasn't.
Yeah. And good thing Afghanistan has not been a lingering issue now for going on close to 45 years, right?
Right.
I want to, we're going to go through a few of these pictures quickly because I do want to get to questions. But as we predicted, we could talk about this till tomorrow morning, I'm pretty sure, Don. I'm enjoying this so much. But I wanted to, you talk about personal style. And of course, many people are familiar with Brezhnev as the great kisser. You had an interesting, I saw you give a great presentation to the history department on how this became somewhat controversial in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mentioned this desacralization that took place after 1975, 76. And there were several aspects of it. One was the fact that Brezhnev loved awards and medals, and he had a whole chest full of them. Some joke called it an iconostasis, the icon wall in the Russian Orthodox churches. It was just covered with metal. And Eastern European leaders, knowing he liked this, people fed on this. They gave him medals of all sorts. Another thing was, of course, the ubiquitous Brezhnev jokes. There was everyone was telling Brezhnev jokes openly, and there was no fear for doing so, in effect. And then there were elements like this when, Brezhnev was quite the kisser. Now, Russian men do hug and kiss, but not on the lips. And this was a signature thing, very unusual. He wasn't an emotional, affectionate sort. But in the archives, I found a letter written from a kolkhoznik, a peasant on a collective farm in the late 70s. And he said, I am so proud of my country. We are the leaders in world peace. We've achieved everything. He was just so proud of his country. We have a new constitution called the Brezhnev Constitution. And he said, but I don't feel comfortable when I see my leader kissing men on the lips. And he said, this must be some leftover from Russian Orthodoxy in Imperial Russia, but I don't feel good about it. Can someone talk to him about this?
You know, it's interesting to me. I don't know if this is at all accurate, but there's also something powerful about that. Going to these people like Dubček, or going to the East German leader Honecker, and getting them to kiss you on the lips. I think it's a power move in
It's a
some ways.
That's a very good point. And I think what he's trying to, and Castro, for instance, what he's trying to stress here is that we're brothers, right?
Hmm.
Brothers in
And you might,
socialism,
we're
brothers in
brothers,
crime.
we're brothers, but I'm the big brother,
I'm the big brother.
and I'm the one reaching out to give you the kiss.
He's the one who initiates it.
Yeah, so interesting. So again, we're going to have to do a little quick run through some of these. When you talk about desacralization, towards the end of his career, we begin to get, these aren't flattering pictures. You mentioned already his stroke, and he also had an addiction to sleeping pills, I understand. What can you speak about his health in the 70s, and what was going on, and how much this was apparent to everyone in the Soviet Union, or
Yeah,
not?
great question. Brezhnev had his first heart attack already in the early 50s in Moldova, or Moldavia. And he suffered from insomnia for many years, already during World War II, according to some sources. But what happens from 1968 on, and no one knows precisely when the pill addiction began, but he became addicted to sleeping pills. And it reached its crisis by 1973. There was a nurse named Nina Kuryakova. She was his personal nurse in the Kremlin, at his residence, at his dacha all the time. And she managed to get rid of all the people around him for the most part, and fed him these sleeping pills, which he demanded, right?
Mm-hmm.
It became such a problem that the head of the KGB, Andropov, Brezhnev's personal assistant, Chernenko, and several others got together, and what are we going to do about this? They found out that Brezhnev had several sources of these pills, of sleeping pills. So what they had a Swedish firm make placebo pills, and they distributed placebo pills so that some of the pills Brezhnev was getting were placebos. It took several years to remove this woman because Brezhnev was so fond of her. There were rumors that their relationship was sexual. And other rumors were that she was a plant by the KGB to control him.
Mm-hmm.
All of this needs to be sorted out, and all the sources are contradictory on that part.
It's interesting, just an aside, Mao had an addiction to these sleeping pills as well, as far as it seems to be a good top communist leaders of the mid to late 20th century were good with sleeping pills.
We also was addicted to smoking. His doctors got him to stop that. But what he did after he stopped, his bodyguards who didn't smoke, when they drove from the dacha to the Kremlin office, he'd have them in the car with the chauffeur, windows rolled up, and they're chain smoking, blowing the smoke in his face. And his favorite bodyguard, Rodionov, in the middle of the night, Brezhnev would buzz him. Nina Petrovna sound asleep next to him, and he had Rodionov light up and blow smoke in Brezhnev's face in the middle of the night because he missed it so much.
Nice work if you can get it, I suppose. I know that, and I remember this, we're not going to be able to get to this, but I'm just going to say, I know that we're going to get people to drive people to your book, Dom, because I know that you talk also about some circumstances surrounding his death, and a little bit of a mystery about who might have been there and the timeline. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of that, but I do think it's fascinating because it made me think about the Death of Stalin movie again, right?
I just want to say that the official death certificate signed by the Minister of Health, he crossed out the time of death and put it different from early in the morning till like 9 a.m., not after midnight. Why? What's going on? And there's some disagreement who was there first.
Nice. Again, I saw the movie Death of Stalin. It sounds a little similar to that, but maybe not quite. The circumstances are certainly different. The Soviet Union is a different place. And what it sounds like to me is that the Soviet Union was largely a different place because of Brezhnev. And because
it was a different, much better, much more benign place because of Brezhnev. And apart from promoting peace and guaranteeing that, and actually people who disliked him in their memoir accounts, they said, they had no sympathy for him. People who really disliked him just because they were opposed to the system they nonetheless said he ruined his health for the cause of peace, that this Soviet man of peace is a very apt and fair. This is how the propaganda organs promoted it, but Brezhnev didn't challenge this because at heart he was, right? He promoted this himself, and that's how he wanted to be known.
And I think this is interesting. We're gonna, Don, I hate to cut us off, but I want to get to the questions we have, and I just wanted to say what I think is interesting is you gave us this this chart here. Let's see if I can fast forward it. Giving you a sense of the legacy. Gorbachev's not doing so well in public opinion. That's negative, by the way. This is positive positive assessment and negative assessment. And when was this poll taken?
Yeah. So what happens here? I mentioned that Soviet Union dissolves in 1991. During the 1990s, Brezhnev was there was no academic writing about him because he was the brunt of all Brezhnev jokes and the laughing stock of the country, an embarrassment, Brezhnev stagnation, etc. Well, it turns out that democracy and market capitalism weren't such a good thing for Russia in the 1990s. And people turned against what and began to look nostalgically back at Brezhnev. From beginning in 2000, the major Levada public opinion survey group in Russia, which is very professional, legitimate, asked Russians, they had annual surveys, who's the most popular, who's your favorite leader in modern Russian history of the 20th century? Between 2000 and 2015, Brezhnev was #1. People look back upon the Brezhnev era as they had confidence in tomorrow, something they lacked in the 1990s and the start of the new millennium.
Well, I think that's great because Elizabeth Brooks had asked the question. I'm curious the current view of Brezhnev in Russia. So we have foreseen that question, and I think we're definitely getting a sense.
And after 2015, he fell from first place. Right now it's Stalin. But Nicholas II is high on the list too. So.
Oh boy. Well, Peter the Great, they just don't remember Peter the Great or Catherine.
20th century leaders, yeah.
20th century only. Okay.
Gorbachev's at the bottom with Yeltsin, but Gorbachev still at the bottom.
Great. I have some questions here. Ed Davis has a question here. Hi, Don. Ed Davis here. I'm going to read your book. Great talk. Does the book contain your old photos? Question. I just finished Life and Fate, and there's a lot about the tension between those in favor of socialism in one country, Russian socialism, and those in favor of a more internationalist approach. Is that correct? And I guess, where does Brezhnev fit in that?
Yeah, and that really goes back to Ed, great question. Hi, Ed, hope you're doing well. It goes back to the 1920s when, again, this ideology is internationalist, right? And the time of the Russian Revolution, the Russian leaders, Soviet leaders truly believed that the Russian Revolution would trigger world revolution. Russia wasn't as advanced industrially as the major capitalist powers, and that revolution in France and Britain, US, etc., Germany would pull the Russian Revolution along with it, right? Well, it was clear by 1921-22 that there was no world revolution, right? And one of the reasons Stalin came to power in the 1920s, after Lenin died, there was a major, the whole 1920s is about factionalism and different groups trying to come to power. Stalin promoted the slogan, socialism in one country, that it is our historical mission. History has presented Russia with this mission to create socialism in one country so that we can be the center of it, and then later promote worldwide revolution. Let me point out that this was a highly nationalistic, not internationalist position, and one that appealed to the unscrubbed, barely literate members of the Communist Party. Now, fast forwarding to Brezhnev, Brezhnev was very much an internationalist. And one of the problems of Soviet foreign policy under him was that Soviet policies always had a duality. On the one hand, promoting the interests of Soviet Russia as a great state, right? But the other was the ideological component, promoting internationalism and socialism. So for instance, take Vietnam. the Politburo minutes, they are so upset over America's role in Vietnam, as I was back then when I was a college student.
I was too, but I was just born in '69. But I was upset.
Rub it in, Max. But Vietnam, in terms of people in Russia didn't know, Soviet Russia didn't know where Vietnam was. I mean, it was so remote, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of Russia as a great power, Vietnam was not an issue, but it became one because of ideology and internationalism. So Brezhnev did believe in the ideology. There's no doubt about that. But he didn't want to be presented as an ideologist. When speech makers like to pepper his speeches with quotes from the classics, Lenin, he'd say, cut that stuff out. No one's going to believe that I'm a theorist.
and he's a realist in many
ways.
Very
much a realist. Yeah. Except, well, again, this ideology does play a role here. They support Vietnam, North Korea. And that's why China was such a difficult thing to come to grips with.
Yeah, interesting. We have one more question we get to. We always go a little bit over. Thank you, Don, for being with us. And
my pleasure. Thank all of you for taking your time today.
We're so fascinated by it. So the question is from Dave Sidor. It's please compare and contrast Putin's actions with the Brezhnev Doctrine. Is there a Russian sphere of influence today? What could be the same and what's different, perhaps?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for that. The Brezhnev Doctrine was officially disavowed with when Gorbachev removed Soviet troops from Afghanistan and then let the Eastern European countries go their own way. So there's never been any discussion of that again or an attempt to resurrect it. What has certainly taken place when the Soviet Union broke apart into 15 successor states, 25 million Russians now lived in what was called the near abroad, right? Mm-hmm. What do we do with them? I mean, if in their new homes, Russians are discriminated against, what is our role? Do we intervene? Do we, whatever? So, these were some real issues. What Putin, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which replaced the Soviet Union, which is pretty much a meaningless entity today. What Putin has done has been to try to resurrect economic ties, right? So the Soviet sort of creating not quite a Russian iteration of the common market, but something a little bit like that, in which traditional trade patterns and things.
Is it resurrecting Comecon in a sense?
Well, Comecon, that was the Soviet trade deal that sort of corresponded with the Warsaw Pact. Mm-hmm. What was different here was Comecon, like Soviet Ukraine grew cotton, only cotton, right? Yeah. And different countries produce different things. That was they wanted integration.
I see.
This is not about integration as much as you have this, we have this. We're historically trade partners, right?
Yeah.
So there's been an awful lot of that. Where that's gotten into trouble is, for instance, today with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Russia actually has an agreement with Armenia, but at the same time has great relations with Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is in fact, the leader in Azerbaijan is a Brezhnevite. One of Brezhnev's members of Brezhnev's Politburo, and someone who promoted the Brezhnev cult, his family, they're still in charge there. So what does Putin do when two neighbors and sort of sympathetic allies? I mean, the Armenians had gone their own way in effect, but realized it wasn't going to work, right? There was early discussions of perhaps joining NATO. They realized it would just isolate them and would not be sound, politically speaking. So they had this alliance with Russia. So there's been no intervention except for, there has been no intervention. There was talk of intervention with perhaps Belarus if Lukashenko is overthrown. And, others, question of Crimea comes up, right? Crimea was part of the Soviet Union, not part of Soviet Ukraine. Khrushchev gave it to them in the 1950s, probably because Khrushchev was born in Ukraine. It was sort of a meaningless thing until the breakup of the Soviet Union. But the Russian fleet's there, right? There was no way and even our former ambassador Jack Matlock, who's a Duke, Jack said most of our former ambassadors thought it's the way they did it that ruffled feathers.
Well, it seems very mid 20th century, and we think we're over that. But then again, a lot of things that seem mid 20th century, I don't think we're quite over yet.
So how Putin has intervened, though, has been the use of technology, spreading, for instance, rumors about the Estonian president or the Lithuanian president, right? Spreading rumors that the Lithuanian president, until very recently, had been a high-class call girl when she was a student in Leningrad. Things like this. So we know about Russian intervention. Right. That's how Russia has been handling these issues.
All right, Don, I hate to call it a day or call it a lunch, but we have to come to them. I just want to mention Elizabeth Brooks thanks you for being one of her favorite teachers freshman year 1998 and 1999, and her husband is a metallurgist, so now she has fodder to tease him about not doing his work too well. So great, really neat connection for Elizabeth to reconnect with faculty. That's why we call this Lunch with Friends. And yes, friends can be our old teachers, like Professor Don Raleigh. One last question for you. What's the timetable on the book, on the biography?
Well, if it weren't for COVID, I'd be in Moscow now. I have another probably two month stint in the archives in Moscow, and probably about a year of processing secondary literature that I haven't read yet. But according to my online note-taking system, I have over 1 million words in notes and tens of thousands of note cards. So hopefully in about roughly a year and a half, I'll begin writing the book. And
we really could do this all the way through till tomorrow morning, couldn't we? Don, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join me today. And stay safe and stay well.
It's a great pleasure. Always a fun learning from you, and we'll see you on the other side. Have you present to a live audience on Brezhnev hopefully soon, and we hope you get to Moscow. I want to thank the General Alumni Association for being such great partners in this project and all of our projects this fall, and Paul Bonici for doing the work behind the scenes. One more time, Don Raleigh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great seeing you. I wish I could see you live, but I get this is the second best thing. So there we go. Have a wonderful day.
All of you too. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.